Let's go ahead and finish up the Mexican-American War. The last thing we had ended up with, General Taylor had just finished with the Battle of Buena Vista, and he is the most popular man in the United States. And President Polk determines at this point that he will no longer continue to finish up the battles to end the war. He does not need to become any more popular than he is. And so he turns the command over to General Winfield S. Scott, known as Old Fuss and Feathers, known for the resplendent uniforms. He was absolutely immaculate in how he dressed, very different than Old Rough and Ready. And he tells him that he needs to get his men from General Zachary Taylor. This is very bothersome to Taylor because Taylor suddenly realizes that he here at Buena Vista, if Scott takes his men to go down and do this southern campaign, he is not going to be able to do any more campaigns, that his time in this war is over. And he begs Scott, please do not take my men. But Scott has been given orders by the president. He has no option, and he leaves Taylor with only a small handful, enough to police the area. Prior to this time, these two men had been very good friends. They had family barbecues together. They were godparents for each other's children. This relationship will never be mended. It is irreparably damaged from this point on. Scott now has a very unusual opportunity, and there is a joint effort now between the Army and the Navy. The Navy transports his men down to Veracruz. From Veracruz, they will then come inland to take Mexico City. Obviously, taking the desert up here isn't going to make Mexico surrender. We're going to have to come down and sack the capital. So the Navy brings the troops down to Veracruz, and that won't turn it here. Here for an entire day, they bomb Veracruz. They are softening up Veracruz. Once softened up, they will then send the troops in. And Scott says, I must land in Veracruz and get through Veracruz and into the mountains. Sorry, I had you go in the wrong direction. Into Veracruz and into the mountains within the same day, or I will lose the war. He is terrified of something in Veracruz. So we will bomb, we will soften the city. Here, artist conception, you can see the bombs going off, buildings being damaged, so that we can, as quickly as possible, get through Veracruz the same day and up into the mountains. Well, if we were holding normal class, I would make you guess what it is he is so terrified in Veracruz, but I do not have time to make you guess, and I have no way of getting your responses easily from you. But as you can see, Veracruz is a coastal town, city. And what he is so worried about is something very, very small. Yes, He knew if he did not get through Veracruz, it would be those little mosquitoes. He had to get into the higher elevations, into the mountains, or he would be attacked, his men would, by malaria, dysentery, yellow fever, and they would be an army of convalescents. He was successful in what he wanted, and within that very day, they marched through Veracruz and into the mountains. He was severely handicapped in his entire Mexican campaign with inadequate numbers of troops, by expiring enlistments, by a more numerous enemy, by mountainous terrain, disease, and by political backbiting at home. He has troops that are from the militia of Tennessee, that are from the militia of Louisiana, from the militia of South Carolina, all these hodgepodge that have come together, and they've enlisted for different time periods, plus he's gotten them from Zachary Taylor, and part of their term has already expired under Zachary Taylor, and so some of his troops at any time were saying, hey, my enlistment's up, I'm ready to go home. And so very difficult conditions that Scott was under in trying to defeat the Mexicans here. Well, his next major battle will be the Battle of Sierra Gordo, which means fat mountain or fat hill. And before this, hopefully on D2L, you have read about the Pastry War. Very short little paragraph on the Pastry War. And you have read about Santa Anna's leg. I think the article is Santa Anna's leg took a long walk. During the Pastry War, which was just prior to the war here, Santa Anna has lost his leg fighting at Veracruz the French, and never missing a moment, he holds a state funeral for his leg. He has a casket. He buries this leg in full military honors. And why do I mention this? Because it does have some value when we get to this Battle of Sierra Gordo. Well, when we enter this battle here, the hill on one side is very steep, and on the other side a bit more gentle in its not as altitude, in its inclination. And so Santa Anna had set up his camp in such a way that all of his weaponry, everything was aimed one direction, because he assumed if you're going to bring an army up, you're going to bring it up the easiest way possible, and you always want the high ground. Militarily, that's the best, have the high ground. He was encamped on top, and all his cannons, all his tents, everything was trained towards the gradual slope, not the steep slope. Well, Scott and his men do not take the gradual approach. Instead, they sneak up, scale the steep back slope. Cannons and all are brought up without Santa Anna even realizing it, and before you know it, bam! He and his men, cannons, guns, everything, are popping over the hillside, attacking, and all chaos is breaking loose. This sort of sounds like Back at San Jacinto, Santa Anna and all his men were sleeping, and suddenly Sam Houston and his men break into the encampment. That Battle of San Jacinto lasted about 20 minutes or less, and it was over. Well, this one probably went a little bit longer, but it was pretty bad for Santa Anna, just as much so. And artist's conception here of the battle, and you can see the very rough terrain of Sierra Gordo, and very close hand-to-hand combat in this fighting. And I want you to notice, we will come to this later, we have here blue uniforms. At least on the American side, they are wearing blue uniforms. Cartoon of the situation at the top of Sierra Gordo. Once again, Santa Anna is caught unaware. He is sitting down to a pot of chicken stew or soup right when the attack takes place. And does he stay to finish his stew? No. Does he stay to rally his men to victory? No. He jumps on a horse and hightails it out of there. Does not stay to lead his men any such thing. And so these cartoons, oh, they're having a heyday with it. General, won't you stop and have a hasty plate of soup? Here's some of your own cooking, and very good, I assure you. And here this is old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott, offering the fleeing Santa Anna some of his own stew. And here's someone else talking about that he just so happens to be acquiring Santa Anna's fighting chicken, his fighting cock there. And look, lo and behold, what do they find? Nothing but Santa Anna's war chest in his tent. So hasty is he to get out of town before he gets captured that he leaves his war chest behind. Now, why is this so important, this war chest? Well, your war chest is where you keep your money. How are you going to keep your troops loyal to you, fighting for you, if you aren't weekly paying your troops? And so how is he going to pay his troops if we suddenly have taken his money? And I mentioned to you earlier about how Santa Anna had lost a leg prior to the Mexican-American War and his state funeral for his leg. Well, he had had a prosthesis made for himself. So hasty was he to jump on his horse and run away that he left his prosthesis behind in his tent. Now, they're not showing his tent here, obviously, but we actually captured his prosthesis as well. By the holy Moses, if here isn't Santa Anna's cork leg. And this paper down here, passport for Santa Anna, James K. Polk. Remember, Santa Anna had been sent to Cuba. He had been ostracized out of his country, and we had removed the blockade and let Santa Anna back into the country where he was supposed to sell the country out and help us work a deal to avoid the Mexican-American War and sell California to us. Well, of course, he did not do that. He rallied the Mexican people to himself and goes up and attacks at Buena Vista, but of course has a horrible defeat at Buena Vista. Well, that cork leg, his prosthesis, when you read the article on Santa Anna's leg, took a long walk. It just so happened, another artist's drawing of Santa Anna leaving the battlefield. Who cares about the men? Let me escape fast. And he is running for his life. And here is, hush, here is Santa Anna's leg. That wasn't supposed to happen. The Illinois volunteers, not volunteers, just a moment. Let me let this dog out. Hush, you. Go. Noisy chihuahuas. The Illinois regiment units captured and took home to Illinois his prosthesis. Now, I have two pictures of it here to try and show you. There is a long piece, and this doesn't, it gets up into here and the picture cuts off, but there is a longer piece that goes up one side, obviously, of the leg, and there is a ribbon that would attach around the thigh on the one side, and the stump would come down in here, and they've got some kind of padding that would make it a little more comfortable to rest the stump in. And then you would continue to obviously wrap the belting or ribbon around down here. Now, you have no joint in that there is no flexibility. He'd have to swing it stiff rather than to have any kind of flexibility. Prostheses have come an awful long way in what we have today versus then. There have been a number of attempts on the part of the Mexican government in asking for Santa Anna's leg back, and the state of Illinois has said, no, we captured it, it's ours, and they're not getting it back. If you'd like to come take a look at it, you may come up to Illinois and take a look at it, but it's ours and we're keeping it. So, Santa Anna's prosthesis from Sierra Gordo up to the state of Illinois. Then, after Sierra Gordo, the next major battle will be at, and I am not sure how to exactly pronounce this, Chapultepec, and this would be like Mexico's West Point. This is where the cadets for the military would be trained. And on the way from Sierra Gordo to this citadel, it was pretty much a cakewalk. As the U.S. Army would come into town after town and encounter the Mexican army, they wouldn't even put up resistance. They would just put their hands straight up in the arm, their arms straight up, hands straight up in the air, and say things like, oh, please, 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 just don't eat us, just don't eat us. And the American soldiers were thinking, what in the world are they saying? Why would we eat them? Remember, Zachary Taylor back at Buena Vista, 4-1 odds, and we won. The Mexican newspaper were circulating these stories. We were like grasshoppers in their sight. They were cannibals, all these things. And the Mexican soldiers were terrified. These cannibals are going to eat us. And so we had very little resistance. The resistance we did finally encounter was not from the regular army, but from these cadets at the Citadel. They put up a defense, and they fought quite ferociously. And it's known as and once again I'm going to slaughter this, the Niños Herodes. I cannot roll that R. The hero boys. And one of them supposedly wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and jumped to his death from the top of the Citadel. They weren't going to just roll over like the regular Mexican army. They were going to put up a fight. And September 13th is a national holiday in Mexico, remembering the hero boys and their heroic fight at the Citadel. This is, from this point on to the march into Mexico City, this is where you get the term gringo from. And there are a number of different versions of where the term gringo comes from. In one place, I have heard for years it came from the fact that at night in camps, the U.S. soldiers would sit out under the stars and they would play the harmonica and their guitars and they would sing about the green, green grass of home. Another source said that they would sing about an Irish song, green grows the lilacs, and that the Mexican soldiers in the surrounding areas would hear about the green grows the lilacs, and that's where the term gringo comes from, or the green, green grass of home. That's gringo comes from. Another commonly known of theory is that when we invaded Mexico, their uniforms were green. And so as their leaders, their captains, their generals would yell at them and say, "Greens, go," based on the color of their uniforms, or "Green coats, go," because of their uniform. Well, as I mentioned to you earlier when I was showing you the Battle of Cerro Gordo, this has no basis whatsoever in accuracy, because the greenish colored, drab olive colored uniform did not come about for use in military, U.S. military, until much, much later at the turn of the century. Our uniforms were all blue, so greens go, no, that has nothing to do with it. So that one is a complete fallacy. What is most likely the truth of where the term gringo comes from is the old Spanish word. And if you could look up in the old Spanish dictionaries from the 1700s, the Spanish word for foreigner is gringo. And what were we? We were the foreigners. We were the gringos. And to this day, in all South, Central, and Mexico, we are today still known as the gringos. We are the foreigners. So, someday on Jeopardy, you now know where the term gringo really comes from, the old Spanish word for foreigner. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Come on. Oh, sorry. Oh, we got to get Mexico City taken. When we did come into Mexico City, fighting was rather stiff from street to street. It wasn't just a walk in the park. They did give us a run for our money in Mexico City. And here, General Scott entering Mexico City. And once again, Grant fighting, leading his men, attacking with cannons in Mexico City. And Mexico City does finally capitulate. We capture the city. Some other very important U.S. gentlemen that also cut their teeth in the Mexican-American War. Here you have Franklin Pierce. He will become president of the United States. He suffers a horrible groin injury during the war while being thrown from his horse. The next day, when they are going to head off, he is told, "You are too severely injured. You are going to stay behind in the camp." And he says, "No, no, 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 I must go with my men." And he tries to rise and get on his horse, and the pain is so severe that he faints dead away and falls over on the ground. Needless to say, he stayed in the camp that day. Well, later in the presidential campaign, they will call him the fainting general, and they will accuse him of having fought many a well-fought bottle instead of battle. And this was very inaccurate. He was not the fainting general because of alcohol. He had suffered this horrible groin injury, but they will accuse him of alcoholism, the reason he was the fainting general. But Franklin Pierce, Robert E. Lee, will go up against Grant during the Civil War. Robert E. Lee also fought in the Mexican-American War. Come on, let's go. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And let me see if I can get a picture. Where's my map? Where's my map? Where's my map? Oh, come on, I have a map here. There we go. Mexico City, right here. And come over here, we've got Mexico City, and there we've got Guadalupe Hidalgo, the name of a city. So just a jump and a skip from Mexico City is Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the treaty will be worked out. Polk had sent Nicholas P. Trist along with Scott to serve as a negotiator. So the assumption is you're going to go in there, you're going to capture Mexico City, we're going to negotiate a treaty, so we might as well send the negotiator with you rather than send him later on. Trist signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2nd, 1848, and he forwards it to Washington. The dates here are so very important. Remember, this is before telegraph. This is before telephone. Anything that's going to get transmitted from point A to point B is going by horseback. Stagecoach, which is still going by horse. Oh, how history might have changed, but for a few days. Gold had been discovered at Sutter's Mill on January 24th. News of it would not get down to San Francisco for a couple of days. From San Francisco to the rest of the world is going to be a bit more time. Now, When the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is worked out on February 2nd, does anyone know that there's gold in them there hills? No! Would the treaty have been completely different if people knew that there was gold in California? I'll bet you it would have been different, but nobody knew that there was gold in them there hills. What does the treaty confirm? First of all, it confirms Texas. Well, we're saying, what do you mean? We already annexed Texas under Tyler. Well, Mexico, in their mind, had never given up Texas. So now Mexico finally says, all right, you've got it, it's gone, it's yours. It also yielded the enormous area known as the Mexican Cession. It stretched westward all the way to the Pacific Ocean, all the way north to the Oregon country. Massive area here. The total expanse, including Texas, was half of Mexico. Now, not the Gadsden Purchase. We will acquire that a few years later from Mexico. But just the Mexican Cession and Texas was half of Mexico. This territory together is larger than the Louisiana Purchase had been. But in the U.S. mind, Texas is separate than the Mexican Cession. So, because of that, the Mexican Cession is smaller than the Louisiana Purchase. But if you put the Mexican Cession and Texas together, it is bigger than the Louisiana Purchase. But in Americans' mind, it is two separate deals. So the Louisiana Purchase is the larger piece of land. The U.S. agreed to pay $15 million for the land and to assume the claims of its citizens against Mexico in the amount of $3,250,000. Polk now submits the treaty to the U.S. Senate. And here is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And here, of course, is the signatures and their wax stamps. Oh, I thought I had a picture of him submitting the treaty. I guess I don't. Just the treaty. Okay. A swelling group of expansionists intoxicated by manifest destiny was clamoring for all of Mexico. Hey, if we sacked the capital down here, Mexico City, why just take the Mexican Cession? We could really, technically, take all of Mexico. And this was really very hotly debated in Congress. Should we not? I mean, we had been toying with the idea of spreading our democratic Republican ideals not only from sea to shining sea, but all the way through Central and South America. So, should we not take all of Mexico? Well, the big reason we did not want all of Mexico, and I love to do this in class because I make you tell me why we did not want all of Mexico. Why did we just take the arid desert northern expanses? The reason being, earlier I had told you there's a very small population up here. What did we have? About 7,000 Spanish Mexicans, less than 1,000 foreigners, and about 70,000 Native Americans, Indians. Well, we discounted the Native Americans. They didn't count. So you've got an extremely small population. Yes, in what was left of Mexico that we let them keep, the northern part was still very desert. But as soon as you started getting into the southern part, the tropical part, oh, how everything changed. You had people, you had lots of people. And we would have to take the people with us. We're not really taking people here. Oh yeah, you got a smattering of people, but we're mainly getting land. Here we're acquiring people. And what are we going to do with those people? First of all, in the United States, we have two types of people. We have white people and we have black people, which are predominantly slaves. Yes, we have some free blacks, but we have predominantly white people and we have slaves. Once again, we have Native Americans, but they don't count. We push them out of our way. We ignore them. They don't count. Well, suddenly you've got all of these tan, brown, Indian people. They don't believe in slavery down here. Remember, they had told the people coming into Texas, don't you plan on bringing your slavery in here. We don't practice slavery. And these aren't black people. Can we enslave them? No, they're not going to abide by that. We can't enslave them. So, since we only have white people and black people, what category do these fall into? We're therefore going to have to put them in with the white people. The white people. And if you put them in with the white people, what are you going to have to give them? You're going to have to give them the rights of the white people. And what do white people have? The right to vote. Excuse me? Are all these brown people, Spanish-speaking, Catholic people going to have the right to vote? Oh my goodness, heavily debated in Congress. And finally it is decided, no. Okay, thank you very much. We will take your arid, lack of people, northern expanses, your land, and we will leave your southern expanses, particularly the deeper southern expanses, with your Catholic, Spanish-speaking, tan brown people alone. You may be and continue to be your own country. And so it is decided we will not annex all of Mexico. We will merely take the northern peopleless half of Mexico. Well, victors rarely pay an indemnity, especially after a costly conflict that had been forced upon us. Remember Polk's message to Congress asking for war? Despite our patient waiting, this war had been forced upon us by the spilling of American blood on American soil. Polk had originally planned on paying $25 million for California alone before the war. But does Mexico know about this? Well, maybe she does, maybe she doesn't. Remember, she had refused to let Trist even present his insulting proposition to them. Well, now Polk makes the arrangement to pay $18,250,000 after winning the war. Well, what does that come out to? Remember those two half-hearted attempts that Mexico had made in 1839 and in 1840 into Texas, and had caused havoc and then run back south of the border. The Texans had made claims against the Mexican government for damage to their state in the amount of $3,250,000. They still have that claim against Mexico. Can Mexico pay that? No. And so the U.S. government says, fine, we will take that debt off your tray and we will pay our own Texas citizens that $3,250,000. So in essence, no, you're not giving it to them. You're giving it to the Texas citizens, but on Mexico's behalf. And we agreed to pay Mexico $15 million for the land that we acquired in the Mexican cessions. Cynics have charged that the Americans had a guilty conscience, and that's why we paid the $15 million. Well, both felt we were fighting in the right, and we had won fair and square. Did we feel like we had a guilty conscience? I don't think so. I don't know. I was not in the minds of the legislators that decided this. But whatever the reason, this has since become U.S. policy. Every time we fight a war and defeat the enemy, afterwards we go in and we rebuild that nation. Why would you rebuild someone after they had done such a thing to you? It has become U.S. policy. World War I, after Russia backs out partway through, has the Bolshevik Revolution. Russia has a horrible famine. 10 million Russians are saved from starvation because of the aid that U.S. government sends over to save Russian citizens. Did we like the Russian government? Absolutely not. Did we like communism? Absolutely not. But were we going to let Russians starve to death because of their government and communism? No. After World War II, the Marshall Plan, we spent millions and millions and billions of dollars in Eastern Russia trying to rebuild the countries there. After World War II, we poured $1 million a day, $1 million a day into the rebuilding of Japan under the sponsorship or rulership of General Douglas MacArthur. Japan was the one that attacked us. We had spent the whole war fighting Japan, and yet we spend $1 million a day in the rebuilding of Japan after the war. That has just become U.S. policy from the Mexican-American War on. As wars go, the Mexican War was a small one. It cost some 13,000 American lives. 13,000 American lives. Most of these were lost to disease, not to bullets, until we hit World War II with the invention of penicillin and the invention of blood typing and blood plasma and giving of blood transfusions. We will then finally, in World War II, have more deaths to bullets than to disease. But we will have more deaths to disease than to bullets. 13,000 American lives lost. But the fruits of fighting were enormous. America's total expanse was increased by 1/3 if you include Texas. And another question I would love to ask you in class and pick your brains. We have had 6 non-indigenous, meaning non-native Indian, non-native flags that have flown over Texas. We even have an amusement park called Six Flags over Texas. Maybe you never even thought of why it was called Six Flags over Texas. Well, it's because we have had 6 flags fly over Texas. And, oops, what are the 6 flags that have flown over Texas? In case you didn't know, first of all, Spanish. Texas belonged to the Spanish Empire. Then for a brief time period in between, still belonging to the Spanish Empire, the French came in and had some control down near the coast in Texas, and so you had the French flag flying. Then, of course, Mexico won its independence from Spain, and so Texas was a Mexican state. Then, for 9 years, Texas was the Lone Star state. Lone Star because there's only one big star. The Lone Star state. Then, during the Civil War, Texas does not side with the Union, but sides with the Confederacy and secedes from the Union. And because the Confederacy loses, Texas is back in once again the Union. So once again, you could actually have the Union flag here, the Confederate, and the Union again. But since it's the same, you have the United States flag. So 6 different non-indigenous flags have flown over Texas. And once again, on Jeopardy, you know the answer to the question. And James K. Polk, the man. His wife, Sarah Childress Polk. They had no children, and she would serve as his personal secretary while he is president. Very beautiful woman. It was said that she had a bit of a dark, swarthy complexion to her. As my son said, she was not a ginger. Where did this term ginger begin? I was never, when I was young, familiar with this term ginger for freckled, red-headed people. But many people said she looked rather like a Spanish woman. She was not Spanish, but she had a dark complexion, dark hair, dark eyes. A very beautiful woman. And another picture of Mrs. Polk later in life. And James Knox Polk. Now this one shows him with shorter hair here, but he tended to wear his hair straight down and long. It was white. Yes, this is how you traditionally saw him, with the long white hair. Unfortunately, he lives only 103 days after leaving the White House. That summer was cholera season, and he gets cholera and dies 103 days after leaving office. Nowadays, we have antibiotics. He never would have died. But, oh, we live in a lucky generation. And his birth house. Now, whether this was later made into 2 cabins or I have not been there, so I don't know the story. But from humble beginnings, he buys his wife a grand house. And he and his wife are buried on the state capitol in Tennessee. He is from Tennessee. Instead of a family burial ground, since he does not have a plantation, a great estate, it's like Barbara Bush and her husband, who has just passed away here recently, they are actually buried on A&M campus along with their daughter Laura, who died very early. A great honor for A&M to have former President Bush and his wife and daughter buried on the campus there. Well, here you've got Polk and his wife buried on the, and right there's the Capitol behind it, buried on the, Capitol property. Some stamps with Polk on them. And the next election, we will get to that in our next lecture. So we end today's lecture finishing off the Mexican-American War and the Polk administration.